I am back moderating for the second topic on the, what is it called? One second. I think so the future potentials of carbon credit, voluntary carbon market, or nature-based solutions in Malaysia. So I understand this is a fairly new topic in this region, in this market. So I think it will be, hopefully it will be enlightening for you. So today I am joined by two of our esteemed panelists. Ms. Margie Ong, Corporate Sustainability and Climate Change from ERM Malaysia, as well as Mr. Milan Koev, the founder as well as Chief Executive Officer from Hexagon Holdings. I would like to quickly start with a quick introduction of our two panelists today. So welcome. Firstly, Margie Ong, she is the Corporate and Sustainability and Climate Change Lead from ERM. So she is a partner in ERM, heading up the Corporate Sustainability and Climate Change practice in Malaysia. Most recently, she was the CEO of Thoughts in Gear, TIG, a sustainability and social impact consulting firm working with corporations to include sustainability and ESG principles into their core business, and with non-profits for strategic and systemic impact. So Margie is also currently in the advisory group for the Center of Planetary Health and Ministry for Responsible Finance and Investment. So she graduated as an electrical engineer. So she has a sustainability leadership certification with the London Business School. And before founding TIG, she's worked with the Boston Consulting Group, BCG, Intel, HCL Technologies, as well as the CIMB Foundation. Right? So give one round of applause to Ms. Margie. And next up, Mr. Milan. So you have a quick introduction of Mr. Milan. So he has over 14 years of international experience in the down and midstream value chain of the solar industry. So he has served as a senior management in the positions in China, Hong Kong, Singapore, with leading project developer such as Sunseed Group, an EPC contractor, race experts, and also with two modules manufacturing companies, REC Group, as well as CNPV Solar Power. At the moment, he is the CEO of Hexagon Holdings. Yeah? So, and please also another round of applause to Mr. Milan. All right, so just as usual, with a quick context on this topic, right? Future potential of carbon credits, voluntary carbon markets, as well as nature-based solutions. So we all know, from the morning we heard about, we all here because of net zero. We all here because we want to be a sustainable nation, a sustainable companies, a sustainable society. I'd like to give a quick context, especially now with the, I mentioned earlier as well, like election season, right? So the sentiment on the ground. So an interesting survey with people out there, a survey done by the National Youth Climate Change, NYCC, so revealed that 92% of young Malaysians think that climate change is a crisis, right? So that's one thing to note. And in terms of nature-based solutions, carbon credit, another interesting fact, 25% of world's total greenhouse gas production is estimated to come from agriculture, forestry, and other land uses. So according to the University of Maryland, the tropics, so which we are in, our climate, we have the tropic climate, which is essentially the lung of the world, right? So it lost about 11.9 million hectares of tree covers in 2019. So that's equivalent to one football pitch lost every 2 seconds. So that's tremendous, deforestations that are happening today, and essentially that is degrading our ability as as a planet in order to absorb all the CO2 emissions that had been generated and produced, right? So definitely in terms of, we talked in the morning about solar energy, solar PV solutions, and energy efficiency. But another aspect, in terms of substituting energy source for lower carbon intensive fuels, some people mentioned about hydrogen in the morning, is definitely not enough for us to meet the target of global temperature rise that is set by the Paris Agreement which is around 1.5 degree to 2 degrees Celsius. At the moment, I think we are already at 1.1 degrees Celsius, so we're not going to be able to meet that. So we need to do more. To give this first question to Ms. Margie. So I think a lot of in the room today may not be too familiar, right? So what is carbon credit and voluntary carbon markets as well as nature-based solutions? So if I may, if you could give a bit of enlighten our audience today on what it's all about. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Taufik. And that was an excellent introduction to kind of set the base. So I've been asked to sort of set the context for the conversation today. So very quickly in terms of definitions, and I'm sure I'm talking to a very informed audience here. I'm very glad to be talking to a room full of folks who are striving hard to help companies outside of this room achieve their net zero goals. And nature-based solution is very aligned to that. So taking a step back, I think as Taufik mentioned, we're all here because we recognize the climate crisis that the world is facing. Now, climate and nature are two, conceptually separated and different topics. However, what's been found is so nature-based solutions it's been pursued by folks like WWF for decades now. And if you ask me 15, 20 years ago, that was very much an area for investment, for philanthropy, and not as much in terms of with the potential of either monetization or a return on investment, for example. Now, nature-based solutions have been found to definitely be able to solve at least a part of the climate crisis that we face today. And that's why you'll also see the term Natural Climate Solutions, NCS, as nature-based solutions to our climate crisis. Because there are many nature-based solutions for addressing other issues as well, whether it is water security, food security, livelihoods, etc. But nature-based solutions for the climate crisis is also known as natural climate solutions. So from that, in that recognition, we also recognize that nature-based solution projects that actually work to conserve and restore some of our Earth's natural potential to retain carbon dioxide without emitting it into the atmosphere, is actually worth investing into. And that's where the term carbon credits come about, because now you're able to monetize credits in the form of conservation or restoration in order to be traded on what we call the VCM, or the voluntary carbon market, in the form of credits. Now, and we can get into this, but there's a huge discussion around the quality of credits, for example, and are credits, for example, giving high-emitting companies a reason or an excuse to continue emitting, and we can cover some of those topics as we go on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So you want to add, Milan? Go ahead.
Yeah, Ms. Margie has a tremendous experience, which I have to come to terms with, but unfortunately I have a different opinion. My personal definition for carbon credits and trading carbon credits is that this is the biggest Ponzi scheme in the history of humanity. And I'll explain the bold statement, but essentially imagine tomorrow you go to the doctor and they give you the worst possible outcome of having a lung cancer, and they tell you to stop smoking immediately because otherwise you'll die sooner. This is what's happening right now with nature and with climate. And instead of stop smoking, the wife comes in and the wife says, okay, you can keep smoking, but you're going to pay more money for the cigarettes. Now, this is ridiculous. Instead of capping the carbon emissions, we put a price on them. This is ridiculous, number one. And number two, in most of the world, the price of carbon credits has absolutely no relation to the amount of carbons released in the atmosphere by this particular country. Zero. Which is again another nonsense. Like countries like China and Indonesia that are polluting significantly. Look at the carbon credits pricing there, or the US, for example. So again, I think this is my personal view, but I think carbon credits is the wrong way to go, and this is probably a policy that will give some certain time for companies to adapt, for manufacturers to adapt, to resource through green energy, but governments being involved in controlling or implementing structures for carbon credits, this is super wrong. And I can give you an example. We're in Malaysia. One of the most ridiculous projects I have ever heard in my career is in Malaysia. Fortunately, it didn't happen. But there is a data center here that has customers that are very prominent, okay, IT companies. And they have demanded the data center to source renewable energy because those are big brands and they need their net zero obligations and so on and so forth. Now, this data center cannot buy green energy from the grid in Malaysia, as we all know. And what they planned to do was to set up a solar farm, which is about 30 kilometers away from the data center, but because they cannot use the grid to transfer the power, they were planning to put batteries, buy 35 container trucks, drive the trucks back to the data center, unload the batteries, drive back to the solar plant, load the batteries, unload, load, unload. I mean, this is, I don't want to say the word. So, and again, in the same time, the government is working on carbon policies. That's not how we heal cancer.
Very interesting. So I think thanks for sharing that. I think in terms of the definition of carbon credits, I think you covered it well, and you bring a very fresh perspective, Milan, on why it is something that this is definitely going to be the perception out there. I'm not saying that I'm a proponent of carbon credits. So as Accenture, I think we also actually bought into carbon credits. We put in monies into carbon credits and also nature-based solutions, because it does go into, and it is something that is verifiable. It does go into, I think, one of the activities contributing into carbon credits and nature-based solutions are stuff like reforestation or enhancements of existing forests to ensure that there is this green lung that you revitalize, because these are lost, as I mentioned, every 2 seconds. About how many football pitch is worth of forests are lost. So there is evidence that it is being used for the good reason and for the good cause, and it helps in terms of absorbing the CO2s. So that's maybe another perspective in terms of carbon credit, right? Probably I will go in a slightly different angle, right? So let's deep dive a bit into the topic. So can you share a bit from your experience, who are the buyers and sellers of these different carbon solutions? So, yeah, want to take that up?
Sure. Thanks, Taufik. And maybe just a very quick response to Milan's fresh point of view, which I truly appreciate. And I think, I'm sure half of you in this room are in the business because you are, to some extent, activists at heart. And I think many of us can, in fact, agree with Milan's position. In my view, in a little bit more of an ideal world, hopefully, and a world that we can, in a world where we can actually accelerate the amount of action that's actually happening out there. For example, huge emitters, whether they be countries or companies, some companies actually emit more than entire countries, if they could, at the flip of a switch, stop smoking, for example, in the analogy, that I think none of us in this room would oppose that, and I look forward to that day when that actually happens. However, being somewhat pragmatic, I think there is a view that the role that carbon credits play is really about ensuring that as that transition happens, and you hear a lot about the word transition and a lot about just transition or fair transition. In that transition phase, we can't say that we're not doing anything to conserve or protect or restore what is naturally capable of being able to contain our CO2. And so this is almost hopefully a stopgap measure where we're enabling companies on their glide path towards decarbonization. Now, having said that, there is also a principle called cap and trade, which I'm really excited about. And cap and trade means that every year, the cap of the amount of credits that you're allowed to buy to offset your carbon emissions actually comes down every year. So the percentage of your emissions that you're allowed to offset is actually regulated and limited every year on a downward trend. And hopefully this will also accelerate the transition towards net zero. And I think principally we're probably on the same page, and I think just that the approach might differ slightly. Sorry, so to come back to answering your question in terms of buyers and sellers. So who are the buyers and who are the sellers? So if you look at the VCM, which will be another VCM in Malaysia, will be launched by the end of the year this year, of which potentially a lot of the supply might be international to start off with. So on the supply side, we have projects. We have carbon credit projects, whether they be conservation or restoration, and ideally high quality credits that are verified by verification bodies. And on the demand side, you have companies who are looking to offset, and in your example, almost trying to buy their way out of emissions, unfortunately. But in the short term, hopefully that becomes an investment into projects that will be worthwhile.
Yeah, I think you're right. In theory, carbon credits are a transitional instrument. Unfortunately, in reality, this has become an enormous industry, and it's growing. And it's artificially driven by the desire of companies just to make a shortcut to less investment or to sourcing less green energy. So what in theory is what the idea of implementing this was, unfortunately did not really play to the reality. And to the question of who buys, well, the usual suspects buy. The usual suspect, those people who have no will, because it's, at the end of the day, it's all about will. It's nothing else, because in Malaysia, most of the public places don't allow alcohol to be sold. Okay, we all drink alcohol, but what's the problem with that? There is a will, the country, the government said, no alcohol, that's it. Simple. It's as simple as that for how we source energy. Now, the role of the government is to enable the companies to source green energy. That's the role of the government. Instead, what they say is they lock themselves in conference rooms and discuss on what carbon credits to implement. But essentially, their responsibility is to enable companies to buy green energy. Now, those companies that are not able to buy green energy, they have no other choice but to go for RECs or carbon credits or whatever there is on the market. And that's Malaysia, unfortunately. But in many other countries around the region, there is the opportunity for companies to buy green energy, and they don't, because RECs are very, very cheap. RECs in Vietnam are 50 cents, maybe 60 cents now per megawatt. And buying renewable energy is even more expensive than the energy from the grid, or on par, maybe a very, very slight discount, but not more than that. So of course, all the textile manufacturers, all the heavy industry manufacturers, all those manufacturers that have no brand reputation to fight for, and these are the biggest polluters because those are the companies that consume the most and pollute the most. Those are the companies that have absolutely no incentive to switch to green energy instead of just filling a couple of pockets with dollars for Rex.
Yep.
If I could quickly respond to that, just
go ahead. Go ahead.
very quickly. So I think, I think one thing I completely agree with you on is in terms of the will. So I think as many of you out there who are trying really hard to sell, renewable energy and really progress the sector, I can hear some of that frustration, and I wish we had a government representative actually on the panel. I think that would be a very interesting conversation. But one thing I do agree with you on is definitely in terms of the will of the companies. Now, the will can be voluntary, which I think let's not hold our breath and count on the fact that companies are going to be altruistic overnight and not be driven by the tyranny of quarterization of shareholder returns, etc. But will can also be, let's call it motivated, and I'm hoping very hard that with the turn of regulations, with concepts like cap and trade, with hopefully increasing price of high quality carbon credits, carbon taxes at borders, that in fact that will is actually motivated by the exact priority that they have at the moment, which is profitability. And they will find after that some time that high emissions will actually hit their own profitability, and it should. And in fact, it will become extremely expensive to be a high emitter, and I hope that happens soon. So I think you're absolutely right. It is about the will of the company, and now it's also about how do we motivate that will to actually accelerate that process.
Yeah.
Just last, absolutely motivation, but I just don't understand this nonsense of people putting still profitability and economy on top of climate. I still see this, unfortunately, in this part of the world more than anywhere else. What other motivation do you need, really? I mean, this is it.
And in all the profitability in the next quarter that you're reporting to your analysts, if you have zero profitability in 30 years because your company doesn't exist, because our life systems are being disrupted, makes no sense. I think we're in complete agreement there. Maybe the way we get there is a little bit different, but I think the ultimate goal of where we want to get to might be similar.
Well, we probably need a little bit of a climate police because voluntary people don't do things that cost money. Someone yesterday was posting on LinkedIn, which I rightfully scolded. Someone was posting that the capex for coal is still lower than the capex for solar in many, many countries. And I scolded them a lot, but at the end I finished with a sentence that capex of extinction is also lower than capex of saving life.
Absolutely.
It's very low. Capex of extinction is zero. We can die tomorrow, all of us, no problem.
No, that's and also on that note on the climate police, I've never been a fan of regulation, but in this instance, absolutely, that's the only way we can go, and that's the only way we can go fast. So for many of you who actually form the solution to this crisis, hopefully you will become the near future heroes of tomorrow, but we'll see when that happens.
Yeah, and if I may give a perspective, I think just to add. Of course, like I said, right, I'm not like a proponent. I don't have any. We don't have any interest. But it is about options to the customers. Imagine companies or that runs an operation in the Middle East. So there's there's only so much they could put. Of course, you could argue that there's a lot of place and land area that you could put solar, but there's sometimes we are faced with the issue of supply chain, etc. So they are looking at options in terms of how do they diversify the way that they decarbonize. That's one. Number two is in terms of ESG. So a lot of companies today talk about ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And there is things about what we call as ESG ratings, right? So investors, the likes of BlackRock, Vanguard, they are increasingly, these are essentially investors in a lot of the different multinationals, and they have started into going into and influencing in terms of how the companies decarbonize their operations. And nature-based solutions provide options for, if the money, I think the main issue that Mr. Milan has highlighted is trust, right? How do you know that the money that you put into the carbon market or carbon credit goes into the right places, that you can actually see the forest that has been revitalized, has been rejuvenated. So that is the trust issues with which something that with solutions such as maybe, of course I'm talking about a bit of a vision here, but things like blockchain. So how do you use technologies like blockchain to ensure that the money that you put in can be verifiable and that goes into the right sources, and it doesn't go into like the Ponzi scheme, right? I think there are ways which we could look at in order to address these trust issues, is the point I think that I'm trying to bring up, right? As a view that we could all discuss and look from today. So if I move on to the next question, right? So then now moving on to Malaysia locally. So I think Malaysia has a lot of forests. So what's sort of potential? I think I want to start to talk into the potential for Malaysia. I think recently Bursa launched the voluntary carbon markets. So maybe you could talk a bit about the potential that Malaysia have with respect to voluntary carbon markets and nature-based solutions.
Yes, and so in terms of addressing the Malaysia climate, and so in terms of potential, to answer your question, there is now obviously a high demand for projects. So if you're involved in PDD's project design documents in terms of actually being able to document and capture nature-based solutions that can be invested upon, you are one of the highest sought and most applicable player at the moment in the market in Malaysia, because there is a lack of demand a lack of supply at the moment with very large demand. Also, back to Taufik's point on ESG, as many of you I think are RE providers in the room, I would encourage you to align yourselves and your propositions, your value propositions, very much to corporations in terms of some of the pressures that they are facing, whether it is, as you mentioned, from investors or governments or even customers for that matter, to be a lot more transparent and, as you know, feeding into, for example, directly into the Scope 2 reduction of their GHG emissions, ensuring that your value proposition is aligned to their disclosures and their transparency as well.
I don't understand what is the relation between deforestation and carbon credits, but I'm going to separate them. I am not an expert in deforestation, but it's a very dumb thing. I don't need PhD. If all of us in this room stop eating meat for 1 month, there is going to be a lot less deforestation, all right? Because majority of the deforestation is happening because of animal farming. But I'm not an expert in this field. And it's carbon credits that, or all the ESG programs that are being planned will probably not achieve anything close to the fancy goals that are being written in some conference room. Again, the most that those will achieve is to fill in a couple of pockets with cash. And on top of that, we are still, in most of the places, we are still growing the carbon emissions. All right? The carbon emissions are still growing despite all the talk, despite COP27 is happening this week in Egypt, all these people traveling business class, thousands of kilometers, speaking for 1 hour, coming back home. Same thing for decades now. The carbon emissions are still growing. Fact.
Yes, and I really enjoy and appreciate the skepticism that Milan is showcasing. Sorry, I think they're pointing out 5 minutes. I'll make it really quick just to respond to that because I really think we need that at the moment in the world, especially in the corporate sector. As many of you know, we need to challenge, we need to be skeptical of all the fancy targets that are published, and we need to be holding a lot of large emitters to account. Now, one of the things you mentioned as well is all of us stop eating meat. So that actually is the tipping point of human behavior. So we know that the state of the world today is a result of human behavior. And that is probably one of the most difficult things and one of the biggest problems facing humanity today is how do we change human behavior? And that goes all the way from the corporate boardroom down to the individual who's eating meat. And hopefully in this transition, as I speak of, hopefully faster than is expected and achieving better goals than we're anticipated. By the way, we're not anticipated to hit the 1.5 at all. Hopefully we can ensure that all of us help to accelerate that, whether it's through regulation, through carbon credits, every instrument and lever that's available for us to accelerate that transition. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Margie, and thank you, Milan, as well for sharing that perspective. And I think that's really a valid perception that many people have, many companies have, and many governments have, right? But there is a lot of talks in the industry between governments and corporations. For example, with a number of the states in Malaysia that has a lot of forests. So there's talks about how do you enable some of these carbon credits, and how do you ensure that instead of you do the logging, right? You cut down all the trees. So why don't we, you get compensated with the forests that are there, and make sure that that is there for the longer term, and then you can actually, earn some credit, some revenue, and that's what is actually happening in the US, whereby the farmers, of course, the core business is to grow the crops, but with the aid of technology, they can map and calculate how much carbon that they are able to sequester or to save, and that is actually earning them additional revenue, and that is an additional motivation for them to actually retain and actually grow more stuff, right, between the seasons, such that they can continue to maintain the credits and sell that in the market, and of course that helps in terms of creating a new business model for the farmers out there, for the agriculture's industries. So this is maybe a different angle of the potential of carbon credit. Of course, as an industry, as society, as governments, there is a lot of work to be done to address all the different doubts that are there, and to really prove to the society that this is a solution that works. And of course, we all is in the spirit of making sure that there are solutions, and for the companies that do want to spend and do want to ensure that they can be qualified to get a cheaper rate of loans, for example. So this is one of the driving factors when banks want to give out loans. So companies that can demonstrate that they are ESG friendly, they put their money in places where it helps in climate change. So it does qualify them to get a cheaper loan. So that is another aspect in terms of how it could help companies and governments to actually put their money on environmental efforts. So I'm not sure how much we have, but I think maybe that leads us to one question, right? I think around maybe one question that you may have in this room is the difference between RECs and carbon credit. Maybe you could quickly address that if you want.
Sorry.
The difference between RECs, so renewable energy certificates, and carbon credit. So from your understanding and your experience, if you could maybe share that perspective.
Yeah, I think Margie is more qualified to answer this question, really.
So very much around, so RECs and carbon credits in terms of the actual REC that you actually get from your green tariffs in Malaysia. The RECs are currently tradable, I believe. So I'm not fully, my focus is much more on carbon credits. And in the carbon credit segment, even though the renewable energies do qualify for carbon credits. Again, going back to the quality of the carbon credits. The other consideration that you might want to have, I'm trying to tailor this to the solar companies out here as well. A couple of other quick considerations as we end this session is in terms of if you're doing rooftop solar, definitely not a problem. But if you're doing solar farms and solar power plants, of course you face a lot of issues around land use and in terms of ensuring that your carbon credits and the pricing of your carbon credits. Three things with regards to land use is around choosing the land that you're actually building your solar farm on, ensuring that there's preservation where you can, and restoration where you can as well to ensure that those carbon credits are retained. RECs, I won't comment on because I'm not an expert. I'm sure many people in this room are actually better at and more of an expert from a solar perspective.
Yeah, RECs, at least from solar perspective, it's a slightly better Ponzi scheme because it goes directly to the benefit of the producer of green energy or the consumer of green energy. So either way, but you know, there is still benefits going to actual production of green energy. So it makes a little more sense, but it's still the same Ponzi, because at the end of the day, you cannot offset smoking cigarettes by going to run every morning. That's a lot of people do that, I know. They call this detoxing or whatever they call it, but they get drunk and then the next morning they go run and they think they're perfectly healthy now. So it's basically the same concept. You have a customer who emits tons of carbon and at the same time they buy renewable energy, but by buying the RECs produced by the renewable energy, they offset the carbon emissions. And that leads me to another topic, which is the net zero topic. What is net zero? Net zero is the amount of emissions released and the amount of emissions captured, okay, which is another nonsense. Because by the time you capture the emissions that are released in the atmosphere, there is a few years gone. There is absolutely no way you can measure at this point of time how much is released and how much is captured. It's never going to be zero. So it's the same concept with RECs. The moment you buy RECs to offset emitting carbon, you're in the Ponzi game for me. That's it.
Okay, very quick response on the net zero. And as many of you are feeding into the net zero strategies of companies, just ensuring that as you look at, so for example, when you talk about moment in time, so when you do the baselining in terms of baseline year and having that GHG emission chart, whether it's your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and in terms of depending on sector, in terms of the percentage of each contribution, of course, your reduction is very much focused on, most of the time on scope 2, looking very much at how that glide path looks. So every company, ideally, at some point in the near future, will have a glide path from where they are at the baseline year to the ultimate net zero strategy, which is either 2030 or 2050. And that glide path or the reduction of each scope or each category of scope 3 will be scrutinized and hopefully transparent, and hopefully we will continue to hold them to account. And along that path, bringing it back to nature-based solutions and our topic for today, many of you will be aware that Bursa Malaysia has released additional listing guidelines on TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. There will be another framework called TNFD, which is the Task Force for Nature-Based Financial Disclosures that are coming up, which is very closely tied to nature-based solutions. And hopefully, again, it's more about holding companies to account and being a lot more transparent. And these are merely the instruments that will allow us to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ms. Margie and also Mr. Milan. And I think we are out of time. All right. Right. So I think we can conclude today's session. Thank you very much for sharing your perspective. And give a round of applause to the two of our panelists. So thank you.